Hello everybody, it's Craig and Richard here again for week 3 feedback video, and there's just been so many great topics, and one of the things that I think that we're really picking up is that there's such a very supportive environment in the discussion boards and so on.
Beautiful, very supportive, very compassionate.
Yeah, people sharing things and sharing resources, and it's just the kind of supportive and mindful environment that we're really glad that is being fostered, and so that's tremendous.
And we'd invite new learners to join that as well by following Jen and Sherelle and really getting amongst the conversation.
Yeah.
It's really...
And just another point too about the speed that you go through the program. Perhaps, from an informational point of view, you can go through it all pretty quickly, but what we hope that you do is take time to savour the program from a practical point of view. Go back to the practices. Work your way through them and see it as at least 6 weeks, but hopefully the rest of your life, to cultivate mindfulness, because it'd be like saying, oh look, I can do all the exercise in a day, rather than actually realising that when we spread it out over a period of time we get more benefit from it. So be patient enough, cultivate patience as you go through the course, and don't necessarily assume just do it in a week and it's all over. So there are a lot of really great topics this week that we'll be exploring. So multitasking was clearly a favourite. Would you like to...
That always kicks off a very interesting conversation, actually, the experiments and the information around multitasking. And I mean, a lot of people think that they can do it. There's a pervasive myth that we can multitask, we should be multitasking, that women can do it, men can't. I mean, there are all these ideas about it. But
And multitasking being paying attention to 2 complex things at the same time.
That's right. So complex things. I mean, of course, we can talk on the phone while we're walking down the street doing a simple and a complex task. But when you're trying to drive your car and talk on the phone, or if you're trying to have 2 conversations at once, that's when we seem to, we find a lot of problems.
And mind you, if we're walking in a complex environment, like trying to cross a busy intersection while we're talking on our phone, that's actually complex multitasking. So the number of pedestrian accidents, for example, are going up because people have got their attention on the phone and they're not paying attention to the colour of the traffic lights, for example.
That's right. And there are just some inescapable realities in the brain, that attentional blink, the switching cost that comes when we switch our attention backwards and forwards. Research has found that if we stop and check an email in the middle of doing a complex task and then get back to the task, it takes about 64 seconds to get our attention fully back on the task. Average, yeah. So, it's 8.5 hours of lost productivity a week, a full day. So. Yes. Definitely. I mean, if we really start to pay attention, we can notice for ourselves some of the very obvious costs that we might not have noticed before.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a bit of a myth. Now, some people may be very good at efficient attention switching, but that's like when the attention's very engaged and focused on one thing and it's able to switch back to the next thing, but it's doing it in a conscious, discerning, prioritised kind of way. And that's what we do when we're being very focused and efficient in our work. And it's not actually multitasking, although it often looks like multitasking from the outside. It's not. It's not got that divided attention.
No, and I think that's what's happening with women as well, possibly. Yeah. This idea about the gender differences there.
Yeah, and the human brain, not the male brain, the human brain is not designed to pay attention to multiple complex things at the same time. But there are clearly a lot of women who are very good at efficient attention switching, and sort of seem to be able to master so many things. And I think that that's really what's happening. And when we're trying to keep 2 complex tasks going and the attention's having to flip back and forth rapidly, we start to lose, the stress goes up, but we start to lose our ability to discern relevant from irrelevant information. And that makes things very difficult. And it's very often when we miss things. And so texting while driving, I've seen estimates up to 164-fold increased risk for motor vehicle accident.
Now that's missing some pretty important things, like people stepping out in front of you.
Yeah, like trucks that have come to a stop, and those kinds of things are not things that you want to miss. Texting while driving fast trains, texting while landing planes, forgetting to put down the landing gear. These are all...
Has that actually happened?
Yes.
Oh, God.
We won't go there and name any... But these things happen and they can have drastic effects.
Yeah.
So multitasking, it's a really interesting thing, but we hope that learners continue to engage with reflection about that.
Yes. Now, it's a different thing, I think, as some learners noted, when we're maybe doodling or knitting while we're doing something else. And I think it is quite possible to do very simple rote tasks while engaged in some other complex task, sitting in a lecture or having a conversation or something like that. And some people even say that just that act of doodling maybe somehow helps them to focus.
Yes, it's probably better than the mind being totally out of the window. So the actual tactile experience of doodling or knitting, if it's a reasonably repetitive task that doesn't require a lot of attention, in a way sort of brings the attention into the room.
Yeah.
But it's probably a transient step, nowhere near as good as if the person wasn't doodling or knitting at all and was able to much more fully engage the attention with the lecture or with whatever else was happening.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Probably a little bit like playing music in the background to drown out background sound when working or studying. You know, it might be good if someone tends to get caught up in background sounds, might be good just to have some music drowning that out. But in time, they might want to move in the direction of actually just learning to focus.
Yes, it's quite an unfortunate thing that for a lot of young people these days say, I can't study unless I've got music on, because almost constantly needing the music to drown out the din of their own thinking or the sort of the background noise. And one day we have to learn to feel comfortable with being able to pay attention in a silent environment. It could be an exam room. Or, for example, pay attention while there's a jackhammer going next door.
That's right.
So what we want to do is have mastery, our ability to pay attention in all sorts of environments and not to have one kind of environment where I can pay attention and the rest I can't.
That's right. And of course, what we're doing with mindfulness is training that attention, training that concentration. So we can certainly move in the direction of being able to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about in the workplace, Craig? A lot of the learners noted that in their workplaces there are a lot of distractions around and a lot of people trying to multitask.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting that some of the big adopters of mindfulness are places like Google, and they're actually not encouraging. I mean, even Steve Jobs himself, he didn't want his kids to be on screens and have all that technology when they were young, because it can really upset your attention. And, again, having efficient attention switching when working with IT is very important. But this sort of notion of multitasking is both good and preferable. It's not. And places like Google are very conscious of this. And if you want people to be creative, and also you want your staff to be well, then people need to learn to micromanage attention in complex environments. And and in a funny kind of way, I think the language around this needs to change, because many people apply for jobs and they say, yes, it is, and it's in the job description.
Must be able to multitask.
Must be able to, and when actually I think the language will need to change. Need skills in efficient attention switching. Multitasking, not desirable. Not if we want to reduce errors and stress and
no, absolutely not.
Improve performance.
And as we've noted during the week in some of the content, that's one of the problems with digital technology, which isn't good or bad. It's all about how we use it, obviously. But I mean, you've got this device that unless we turn off the notifications, it's constantly inviting us to switch our attention to something else. And then we start that and we're halfway through a text and bing, here comes Facebook or email or that kind of thing, and we get that little hit of dopamine every time. So learning to manage that is a really important thing in the modern world.
That's right. And taking control of the environment, removing the unnecessary distractions in as much as we're able. Turn off the email notifications while we're trying to stay engaged in a complex task, for example.
Yep.
But there's this kind of compulsion. About a third of people these days have an addiction to their technology, cannot control the behaviour, feel compelled, feel anxiety with withdrawal and so on.
As much as a third.
Yeah, and this is not a liberating thing. This is an addiction like anything else, and all of a sudden it starts to rule the person's life. One of the favourite Leunig cartoons, there's this iPhone on the desk, and the man's looking at the iPhone, and the iPhone
I'm not
saying
your device, you're my device.
That's right. Yeah, and so I think we're gone from being the masters of the technology to being its faithful servants. So now, there have been some of the learners have been talking about mindfulness being challenging, and some learners are saying getting so much out of it, coping better, but others are saying it's a bit of a struggle. And I think that we really need to be a little bit kind with ourselves and just see that there are various steps in developing mindfulness. The first one's being getting a look at the land. It's the lay of the land, because we start to notice our distractibility, we start to know our reactivity and stress and so on. And we should take this as encouragement. I know
it's an important first step, isn't it?
I know it doesn't sound right, oh, wait a sec, I want to feel comfortable and everything's all right. But to actually see what's going on, being informed about it, and to start to cultivating that non-judgmental attitude to it, that sort of benevolent kind of curiosity to it. That sort of self-compassionate attitude is a really important thing, and we'll emphasise that again. But it's one thing we would hope that you come back to, because it's not always easy. I mean, mindfulness is very, very simple, I often like to say, but it's not easy. And a lot of learners are discovering that.
It's a little bit like these unconscious habits we have, are a little bit like walking around in a dark room, aren't they?
Mm.
You don't notice that that's what's happening. Every now and then it causes problems, reactivity, stress. And with mindfulness, we light a lamp. And we start to see sometimes the mess that's in there. And people quite often report early on in programs, oh, this stuff's making me crazy, this is making things worse. And actually it's not. It's just actually showing it.
We were crazy before.
Now we're just seeing it, which means that there's something that we can do about it. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The longer meditations are hard as well.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, sitting with that crazy mind sometimes is a little bit hard, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
the monkey mind jumping from tree to tree.
That's right. And we start to notice that when we meditate or when we practice mindfulness at all, and some people find that even 5 minutes is a long time just to sit and just to be with themselves. And so, of course, that's very interesting in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah. Dog metaphors are great for mindfulness. And another dog metaphor, I mean, if a dog's got a ball in its mouth, like the mind, and then we start running after the dog to try and get the ball back. The dog just keeps running, and mostly dogs will tease you. They'll just run just a couple of steps in front of you, and they'll just sort of show you that they've got the ball as they run away from you. They'll always stay a step in front of you. But if we just sort of find the dog runs away with the ball, we just sit on a park bench. That's fine. The dog runs around. The mind runs around. Just sit down. Just let it run. Not getting caught up in it. Eventually the dog comes back and it just drops the ball at our feet, in a way. And so this kind of thing that we sort of get angry or frustrated about, that distractibility of mind, I think is an important phase in learning to develop that different sort of sense, and just not chasing the mind, not trying to subdue it. Just sit, and eventually it'll tire itself out and drop the ball, and there may be some relief from that.
So we're cultivating a non-judgmental awareness. I think sometimes that non-judgment lags just a little bit behind the awareness, doesn't it?
The little practices can be very helpful as well. We use a metaphor like full stops and commas. A full stop might be a longer practice, but a comma, and that's C-O-M-M-A, because if it's C-O-M-A, that's a coma, and that's not mindfulness practice at all. But those short practices can be 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. I can remember running a program, and one of the participants, this was with the health department, it was a head of a busy city emergency department. He said he'd learnt these kinds of skills some time before, but he said when he steps up to the bedside for like a major trauma, road accident and so on, he called it centering, but he centers himself for a moment. And he said it was only 1 or 2 seconds just to check in with his body, just to notice where his mind was, his attention, just to be aware of his state, and just to breathe out and then engage with the activity. Nobody outside would have recognised what he was doing, but he said it was just so centering and helped him to be aware of what his own state was as he was about to enter into what could have been a very challenging situation.
The vice president of Google actually has a 6-second mindfulness practice. She says every time she walks into a room to start a meeting, she pauses and just takes one breath. Just maybe resets, lets go of what she was doing before, sets her intention for the meeting. So simple things like that. I mean, it can really be, 1 second practices throughout the day can be actually quite useful, as well as the longer meditations.
They're little mindful moments. They're very important.
What about using the recordings as well, Craig? I think that's pretty useful early on.
Yeah, I think using a guided practice can be very helpful initially, but I encourage people not to feel dependent to use them. I sometimes think of it a little bit like trainer wheels on the back of a bike, when we first get on a bike and falling off. And the trainer wheels sort of help us to sort of keep our balance. And people often find it more pleasant and easier with a guided practice. And that's good in itself. But that's not necessarily doesn't necessarily mean that's the better practice. Because when we practice by ourselves, the attention goes off more, we get angry at ourselves more, and so on. And well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we're much more confronted by our own distractibility and our own internal attitudes, habitual attitudes. So the attention goes off and we're left up to our own devices. Bring the attention back, gently back. Criticising, not criticising. And it's a little bit like training wheels on, easier and more pleasant. Take the training wheels off, not so easy, not so pleasant. But actually, if you ask the question differently, which one's going to train our balance better? Training wheels on or training wheels off? It's the training wheels off. Which one's going to train our mindfulness capacity better? Guided practice or non-guided practice? Ultimately, the non-guided practice, because then we're left up to really exercising and using those circuits in our own brain, our own awareness, and cultivating that. And that goes much deeper ultimately. So see it as a phase and then move on after, using the guided practice, start to practice independently.
Because, of course, the whole point is to be mindful in each moment without needing recordings to remind us in day-to-day life to do that. So,
yes, that's right. There are other issues raised which we might just sort of touch on briefly, but about avoidance, for example.
Yeah, a lot of the learners were saying that when they started to really tap in and to notice with that non-judgmental awareness their habits around procrastination, they started to realise that just beneath the surface there, where they might have initially thought they were just being lazy, there's actually quite often a lot going on. Fear, for instance, fear of failure, fear of success. I mean, a whole lot of stuff that we start to become aware of when we pay attention.
It's very interesting to see those sort of just levels of what's going on in our own mind, just one or two level down. Yeah. And or sometimes just a preconceived idea about a task being bigger than it actually is, and that idea is like a sort of like a total roadblock and so on. So that kind of awareness that's really useful sign of it deepening as well. Perceiving stressors that aren't there. As Mark Twain said, I've had a lot of catastrophes in my life and some of them actually happened. I mean, we practice a little bit of mindfulness and all of a sudden we realise the mind's very good at catastrophizing. It's very good at imagery. It's doing imagery all the time, but mostly we're taking the images to be real, and reality, present moment reality, is not getting a look in at all. So this is a very useful sign to start to notice that, because that's 99% of our stress where it's coming from. We're perceiving things to be real that aren't actually real. Much of that has to do with future and recreating things from the past, generally with embellishments as well. A couple of other things were mentioned as well about physical health. There's a lot on the physical health, and we won't go into psychoneuroimmunology now, but better immunity,
sure?
less inflammation, less allergies. Yeah. Because when we're very stressed, the stress hormones that are a part of that, they include inflammatory hormones. And they're great when you're wrestling a tiger and so on, but they're not great day in, day out, in the middle of the night. And that causes immune dysregulation. We get the worst of both worlds with our immune system. Pain as well. That very often when we're reactive to pain, we amplify the intrusiveness of the pain by what we're thinking about, how our reactivity to it. So when people learn mindfulness, one of the first areas researched by John Kabat-Zinn was with severe chronic pain.
Yes.
And about 80% of people get major improvements through mindfulness practice. But they were practicing 30, 40 minutes a day, not just 5 minutes.
And psoriasis as well. One of his early studies also showed that a bit of mindfulness practice actually reduces the size of psoriasis lesions. So that was also, I mean, that's a very obvious physiological measure that's not just self-report.
Yeah, and studies on epigenetics, for example. Meditation changes the genetic levers and switches, like down on the level of the DNA. Down regulates inflammation and up regulates healthy immunity. That's why about a quarter of the number of days off sick with acute respiratory infections for the mindfulness group in another study. Acceptance and fear of death. I guess this is a big question. We're not finishing the course, but the big questions come up already.
It's good, isn't it? Some big questions coming up as we go through this course. And I think that's one of those things where people start to look a little deeper. We start to notice, hang on, maybe I've been avoiding this sort of existential fear that we all carry, actually, when we really start to pay attention. And some of the learners were saying that they were willing to confront that in a very present, non-judgmental, accepting way. And some of them even said that they've started to realise, well, maybe I better plan for my funeral, rather than leave it to other people to deal with when I've, avoided it for my whole life.
Yes. I guess it's the big question in terms of transience, and mindfulness teaches us on a small scale, but eventually on a big scale, that everything in our life is transient, coming and going. Yeah.
And there's a lot of comments around letting go of the past and how difficult that can be.
Yeah. And failure, the self-criticism, the recrimination, and not being able to move on from that. And it's very important. I mean, I don't think there's any human beings on the planet who haven't made mistakes, and this is what we do. And we either relive and amplify and reinforce the mistakes, or we acknowledge our own humanity, mistakes been made, but pay attention to what happened in a grounded way, way grounded in the present moment, but learn from the experience, because that'll stand us in very good stead. And that's something that really takes a bit of patience, because the temptation to self-criticize doesn't produce anything particularly useful. In fact, it often distorts our understanding of a situation, and we're destined to keep doing those mistakes. Boring task came up, and just briefly say something about boring tasks.
Yeah, a lot of people find that when they start to practice mindfulness, the simple act of breathing or focusing on what they're doing seems sort of quote unquote boring. And I think that's often got more to do with listening to thoughts or judgments about the activity that we're in rather than the activity itself.
Like an internal dialogue. Oh, I can't stand this. When's it going to be over? Oh, I'll practice some mindfulness. Oh, it's still not working. I hate doing this.
Yeah.
And the attention's not actually on the tactile experience of doing the task.
No, it's very much caught up in all those judgments and reactions, which is actually maybe making the task seem boring or making that moment seem boring. And of course, in that moment, if we're practicing in that way, where is our attention? Is it actually on the breath or the task, or is it in the future or the past, or caught up in something else? And that's I think, the important thing to pay attention to when practicing.
Yeah, there was actually, just very briefly, an interesting study in a psych journal, and it looked at doing a mundane task of washing dishes, and they taught the college students to do it mindfully compared to the control groups. Now, those who washed the dishes mindfully had more positive affect, less negative affect, and a lot less stress, and enjoyed the task.
So even something like washing dishes can be enjoyable if we approach it in a particular way.
Yes, very much so.
Yep.
List making can be good for grounding attention. It can be an obsession, so it can be a way of being organised. I dare say, nerves and performance, maybe this is something we can discuss more in the future, but just very briefly, a word or two on nerves and performance. What's happening there?
Well, again, I think we're just quite often caught up in ideas about what's going on rather than actually paying attention to what's happening in that moment. And that can, of course, trigger the stress response and make us feel anxious about outcomes. I think of Novak Djokovic crumbling under pressure, thinking about the outcome of a match, versus now, learn some mindfulness, can actually just pay attention to what's happening in that moment, let go of failures, just stay present and working for him.
And I think in the lead-up, we're projecting ahead, or in the moment of performing, our attention goes on ourselves and goes off the task, and that's a very important issue as well.
Yep.
All right, in the dark night of the soul, just give that breath, give that pillow your full and undivided attention. And so this is perhaps all we've got time for today. We've covered a lot of topics. You can go to the various parts that you want to listen to, and we'll look forward to being with you again next week for week 4 feedback. Have a great week.